All right, so we are recording, and I do want to just welcome John Kennedy and Karen, I'm forgetting Karen Leduc from NASDAQ, here to talk through the study that everyone hopefully has had a chance to look at a little bit. Here comes
Yeah.
John, let him in.
It's a pleasure to be here when talking to you and following up.
Thank you. And with that, so Josh, I just introduced John Kennedy and Karen Leduc from NASDAQ and thank them for being here, and turn it over to Kevin to jump into the agenda.
Okay, for a round of introductions, I'm Kevin Hansom. I'm a Bristol board member and the dubious chair of this little group. We have two other board members. Sarah LaPearl is the second one. We have a couple community members, Jeff Muller, and Josh Crandall. And then Patrick and Patrick's staff, Floyd's here today and Katrina's here today. And then we have Liz Sayre, who is a Bristol board member and also a member of the Communications Engagement Committee, who's here as, I guess, technically the public. So we'll call the meeting to order. It was 3 o'clock when we started, so we'll call it together, and we need to have somebody volunteer to take minutes. Any volunteers?
Pen this time, so I can try.
Oh,
Okay.
I love that. I'm multitasking.
Yeah, well, that's great. We can share the love, if you will. So at this point, we've got that little housekeeping detail taken care of. We'll ask for any public comment if there is any. Sounds like radio silence, and everybody's in, Patrick, right?
Yes,
Okay.
double check. Yeah, I don't see anyone in the waiting room.
Cool. So then I guess our next item is action to approve the minutes. What's the board's pleasure?
I'm happy to approve the minutes. Can Josh maybe mute his? Maybe it's not. It's all like static, right?
Okay, yeah, so I guess we're picking up background noise somewhere, so if everybody could mute except for who's talking, that would be great. And whoever's not muted could like do something with the minutes.
Yeah, I'm happy to approve the minutes.
Anybody second that?
I'll second.
Cool. Any discussion? Okay, no discussion. Let's, everybody that's in favor of approving the minutes, please say aye. Thumbs up. Anybody opposed? Okay, we're taking care of that. Next item is the NASDAQ report, and we were fortunate to have Karen and John here today by Patrick's arrangement. So Patrick, if you want to give a little overview of your initial impression, and then we can, was the intent to have John and Karen present then?
Yep.
Yeah, I think we could certainly allow them to give their overview, but mostly I wanted to make sure, as folks had a chance to read this, to offer a Q&A if there was something that was, caught someone's attention or wondering they had the opportunity to kind of talk things through with John and Karen would be great. I spent a Well, a good probably hour and a half, I guess, we spent together on Thursday of last week, John and Karen, kind of walking through the document, trying to help me understand it better and make a couple of changes to the document in preparation for the draft that went out for today's meeting. And thank you for your quick turnaround. That was great to see, and hopefully that gave everyone a chance time to read it. Yeah, I think nothing super surprising to me in reading this report in terms of we have declining enrollment. That was something I anticipated to be true, but we have a different lens on that, another deeper analysis on our enrollment, which confirms that yes, we are losing students, and it gives perhaps more reliable information on how many students, and that will help our planning, I think, a great deal. One of the things that John and Karen and I talked about was capacity of our buildings, because that's another really significant piece of information in terms of building our plan going forward. And through our conversation on Thursday, we were able to make some adjustments in how we think about our buildings' capacities, which I think is useful for today's meeting. And then talking through the scenarios, which is probably where the rubber kind of starts to hit the road. And we've done a lot of work as a community around our community values and what possible scenarios we wanted to consider. And as John and Karen and I talked on Thursday, some of the scenarios some of the options that they created for us matched up really well with some of the scenarios that we came up with, and some were a little different, and some of them sort of were missing one of the scenarios that we came up with as a community. So we had a good conversation there, and I think there were some changes in that regard as well. So we've had a great back and forth. It's been a great working relationship with NESDEC so far, and thankful they can be here and continue that conversation.
Okay. All right. Well, again, as we had mentioned in our conversation with Patrick and earlier, we are very pleased to be able to assist with the process. And we have completed the demographic study, as well as the updated enrollment projections. And based on that information, we have been able to utilize the data that we had gained to go forward with updated projections, and then taking the student projections and analyzing those. And we then also went forward and took a look at the capacities, and with that information, capacities of each of the schools. And so when you have a situation where you have enrollment projections and school capacity, that then enables the development of the set of options. And so what we did at the last session, and this would be up to Patrick to determine whether he wanted to go forward with it this time, was we responded to any questions that had come up with regard to either the demographic analysis or the enrollment projections. And then from there, we moved into the capacity analysis and any questions that arose there. And then finally, we discussed the options and dealt with any thoughts that might have come forward in terms of questions or needs for adjustments. So the document that you see currently is a revised document that does reflect, for the most part, all of the discussions that we had. There may be a couple of minor edits that still need to be taken, but essentially the info is based on what we had discussed. So I don't know, Patrick, whether, Karen, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I just want to add that we were very pleased to work with the administrative team and each administrative team at the schools. Very helpful, a great place for learning for your students. So thank you for welcoming us in.
Yeah. They were fantastic and enabled us to move forward with the project very well. They were tremendously helpful with follow-up and providing key information.
Yeah, John, I feel like that approach that you offered in terms of how to kind of walk through the different section of the document, I feel like that worked well for us and might serve us well today also.
Okay. So let's take, first of all, you can see that if you go through this page by page, slide by slide, the first part is an introduction, and it talks about the agreement and the goal of the project to provide a basis for decision-making with regard to future level configurations, building renovations, construction, and alternative facility use. And then if you go to slide number 5, you would see there that we talked in terms of the scope of the project, and we did an enrollment trend analysis and instructional program and facility best use analysis, and then we developed the options. However, you can note that there is a slide number 6, which talks about the scope of the report and adjustments for the pandemic. And the important thing there is that we have advised, and the district wants to go forward with an update in based on the October 1 enrollments, which will also include a review on our part of any of the key factors that we had used in developing the demography, which led to the enrollment projections. So we will be back in touch with some of the key community town government officials who had provided us with information, and we'll be doing a quick check with them to see if there have been any major changes. Plus, we will have available the October 1 numbers for the district, which will then give us a very good indicator in terms of, the consistency that we're anticipating, or lack of it, depending on what might occur. So that scope of the report piece is something that is, we feel, important, and most districts want to see the October 1 numbers, because obviously that gives them a little better indicator in terms of any changes that might be occurring. So that's that piece. Any questions on that? Okay, and then with the sorry.
Back up. As chair, I try to hold back and let the rest of the board question things, because I tend to talk a lot. But I guess with the whole COVID thing, there's different aspects that are on our mind about who's going to send their kids to school and how much it's going to cost and all that kind of stuff. But in the back of my mind, you hear all this buzz, and like everything, there's two universally 180-degree apart points of view on every issue, it seems like. But anyway, there's this belief, or there's this trend, or there's the beginning of a trend of people leaving the cities, primarily New York City, which is very close to us, and resettling. And you hear, Vermont's getting inundated with people resettling here. VPR had an article just a couple days ago where, they kind of pigeonhole different types of people coming into state. But do you have, I guess the question is, do you have any sensitivity as to, and it's very early in the game, obviously, but anything there that's going to affect the enrollments? Or, I mean, there's also a lot of complications if people are coming as older people, or people coming with children, all that kind of stuff.
Yep. Well, that's really interesting that you brought that up, because I was in conversation earlier today with some realtors in the Berkshires, and we're doing projects there as well. And they indicated exactly what you just said, that there has been an influx of folks coming in from the New York City area, and many of them are, in fact, people who are millennials. And as a result of that, there is that potential that they would be child rearing, because the millennial generation, as we noted in the study, is now the child rearing generation, and most of them are between 30 and 40 years of age. So they have made the determination that if they're going to have a family, they would do it. Another factor that comes into play is because of the pandemic, many people have been working from home. And many people now have been asked to continue to do that. And so the some of the people who are millennials, there are several articles out there that indicate that they may be considering making a move from cities where they have been working and paying very high either rental fees or housing fees, and moving to areas which are viewed as more affordable and less congested. And so you're right, those are two factors. We will have a better handle on that, but not a permanent handle on it when we get into October, November, because at that point we will be seeing additional enrollment info, but B, we will also be making recontacts with realtors and others in community, in government, to determine if there have been significant changes. So that's a key question. And obviously the current projections do not take that into consideration, and that's why we feel it's very important to have a follow-up in the fall, and again a follow-up obviously next year. But we think a follow-up in the fall with realtor input, et cetera, will be helpful.
Yes.
John, we have a similar historical data point from 2001 that we can look at. Can you hear me okay? John, can you hear me okay?
I'm trying to hear you a little better, to be honest. Go ahead again.
We have some historical data from 2001, potentially, and some of the population movements related to things. Do you know comparatively what the wave was like with the population movement and how many people actually stayed remote from these city centers?
Well, we think that the overall, there was, during that period of time, 2001 through 2006 on the national level, there was a significant increase, actually through 2008 in many parts of the country and New England. There was a significant increase in the number of home sales. That was a major time period, and it was referred to frequently as the housing burst or whatever. And therefore, many communities experienced growth in housing during that time period. And with it, obviously, most people who purchase a single family 3 or 4 bedroom home are going to be people who either have children or are anticipating that they will have children. And so that was a major factor on the national level, followed, of course, by, and we reference this in the report, the economic decline, which occurred between 2009 and 2012, and some places into 2013, where housing sales declined very significantly. And since that time, we have seen a return with regard to sales, and also a return with regard to new home construction, which has been fairly significant. But does that respond to your question?
Yeah, I was thinking more of the people who migrated from 9/11 away from New York City as a similar occurrence to the pandemic. But maybe I'm drawing a parallel too soon.
Well, the part of the answer to that is that in earlier times, it was more difficult for the millennials who were the potential child-rearing generation, even as we get into the mid 2010 or before that. It was difficult for them once they got out of college to get a job across the board. And so they were in many instances having to be employed in cities or close to cities where they would be having to commute. And as a result of that, many of them, did not go into the suburban or rural areas to purchase homes. That has been changing recently, even before the pandemic, and we expect that it may continue to do so as a result of the pandemic, based on the info that I had provided earlier.
Great, thank you.
And for what it's worth, I think to that point, in that window of time, interestingly enough, at MAUSD, which then was Addison Northeast Supervisory Union, my printout anyway is missing some labels on some of these pages, but I think it's true that we lost students during that 2001 to 2007 or 8 window, when we might find some similarities between then and what's happening now. We still lost students.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it's a possibility. As I said, it's the enrollment projections we feel are fairly acceptable and accurate, especially over the first 5 years, because they are based on A, births, and B, we use the cohort survival method with adjustments to it. But in other words, the projections are largely based on what is already in the system, plus births and other key info that will affect what comes into the system. And so we think that the first 3, certainly 5 years of the projections will be, are the most accurate, because they're based on information and factors which already exist.
So are there any other questions about the demographic analysis or the enrollment projections that we could help you with?
I had a question about the demographics. It hasn't quite come up in the presentation yet, but if I recall correctly, and I only had a chance to read it quickly, I think all the demographics were based on the district, and there was no data or analysis of demographics by town. And I was wondering why that was.
Well, we did have some demographics by town on several slides. For example, one of the slides that we think is an important one is the median age of the population. It is slide number 13.
Right, I was thinking of the demographics of enrollment of students in the individual towns. I know that data is there because we've seen it before. And we have, this presentation aggregates data on a district-wide basis, and I was wondering why it didn't drill down into towns, because when you get into options, without prejudging what option might be selected, it has the potential to fall on individual towns if there's a closing, but that information wasn't here.
Well, we went on the basis.
Could be here and I missed it.
Well, the only thing that and Karen, you can move in on this if you'd like. The only thing that the factor that we did consider was the school enrollment of each of the towns, and that was it, and also because we were considering the elementary schools, and so that was an important piece that we utilized, and so that was a factor that came into play. And the other piece is that with regard to the various communities, each of the enrolled students was assigned to a particular school. So we were able to compare that enrollment over a period of time and have an idea in terms of what was going on. And based on the fact, that we also had information for each of the towns on how many single-family home sales they had, how many new permits they had, new construction permits and so on. That also provided us with key information with regard to potential growth.
We also look at the district holistically, but it is important that we look at each of the elementary schools and look at their enrollment numbers. And from projecting enrollment, the sample size is really too small for us to be able to project. We know what the current enrollment is. I'm going to use Beeman because it's alphabetical, is 79 students over K to 6. So we can look at that and then look at the capacity of that school plus the capacity of the 5 other elementary schools. But as the way to look at the enrollment projections, it is holistically. You may have, as a district, received them by school. When I was in Patrick's role as an assistant superintendent, we did that internally. But that is not something NESDEC does. We could do it holistically, looking at the 79 and projecting historically and geographically, but that's a separate task.
So wouldn't I don't want to belabor this point and take too much time, but if the superintendent decides to go down the path of proposing that some schools be closed and selections about which schools to propose be closed are made, wouldn't we need to look at the enrollment trends of individual schools as opposed to the district enrollment?
The district can actually look at their historical enrollment over the K to 6 lens. Sometimes you'll get a kindergarten class with 6 students, and 5 years ago you had 15 in that class. So that's why it's difficult for NESDEC to predict, but Patrick and his team can certainly provide you with the historical enrollment data, and you can look ahead.
Yeah, no, they already have. I was just wondering why you guys didn't consider it in your report, but that's fine. I'm happy.
Good.
And I think, Jeff, in terms of going forward, in some ways that could be useful information. In other ways, it may not be, because what's more important is how many elementary age students are we going to have overall, and what's the capacity of the various buildings to house elementary age students. How many of those students are particularly in any one town is only somewhat relevant. And knowing what NESDEC's projections are in terms of overall elementary age students, we can sort of dial our projections by town into their overalls to make sure that we're a little bit more consistent. So I think we can get to that for to the extent that it's needed, using their information combined with our internal processes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so for the enrollment projections and then the demographic, do you want to move on to the capacity?
I just want to acknowledge what caught my attention from the enrollment perspective was sort of twofold. The loss between now and the next 10 years was significant, at somewhere around, I think it was 200 students.
Correct.
That's that's a lot. If we multiply each of those students by 20 to 22,000 or so over those next 10 years in terms of what the spending per student might be, if we think about that in terms of revenue, that's a big dollar amount. And so that thought was going through my mind as I looked at the enrollment. And then when I took a broader view, I found this to be curious as well, and sort of telling in terms of the struggles that we find ourselves in. At one point, our district had just about 2,000 students in it, going back maybe 20 years.
Mhm.
And looking out 10, we're projected to get down around 1,100.
Yep.
So that's 900 students in that 30-year window that we would have lost, assuming this projection holds true. That's a lot of students. And I just want to sort of call attention to that, because that is why we are facing the challenges that we're facing. It's more than just the last couple of years and the next 5 years. It's this 30-year trend
Right.
where we anticipate 900 students. That's the equivalent of all the students currently in Mount Abe and Bristol Elementary School combined that we've lost over that window of time.
Well, and that's obviously almost a 50%, and that's a significant decline in terms of student enrollments, and it does have an impact on a lot of factors that come into play with the utilization of school facilities.
John, what struck me as curious is the communities continue to build single residence, and yet the population is continuing to decline. And maybe it's because the population is continuing to skew older, but I have a hard time, and I should know this as an architect, I just have a hard time wrapping my head around the numbers in that way. Did your realtor friends shed any light on that, John?
I had the same observation, Josh. On page 15, where it shows housing details by town, it shows that in the 10 years from 2000 to 2010, we added 474 additional dwellings, 10%, while the student population was going down. I don't know what conclusions to draw from that, but I was struck by the irony of it.
Well, I can add a little bit to that, because I also am on the Bristol Planning Commission, and we've struggled with this rewriting. We're in the process of rewriting our town plan. A lot of what's happening is there are a lot more single wage owner occupants, if you will. Families divide up, that sort of thing. All of a sudden, a family divides up. You don't have one house, you need two or two occupancies. And the trend, there's enough of a trend of that you know, there is a lot of more houses required to house the same amount of people that were in a family unit in the 50s and 60s. And also along with that is a lot of older people are coming into the area without kids. So people might be buying, and people still want a 3-bedroom house, and irregardless. And a lot of it has to do with marketability. You know, anything other than that tends to be considered to be less marketable. So even if you've got a couple of empty nesters or whatever, they may still be filling out a 2-bedroom house, or if they've separated ways, they're going to be filling out two 3-bedroom houses. So the population is not changing. The occupants are changing, but they're requiring more housing for the same amount of shelter, if you will.
I'm also remembering Governor Scott's sort of platform when he was elected governor was this sort of 3-2-1 platform, where the challenges facing Vermont then, and presumably are still true, The 3 represents that we lose 3 students from our education system in the state every single day of the year. 2 representing we lose 2 people from the workforce every single day of the year because we're a graying state, as he put it. And 1 being we have 1 child born addicted to opioids every day. So I think that tells our story a little bit, that maybe we have, and our population as a state is staying relatively flat, maybe ticking up just a tad or down just a tad. So our population's staying the same, but we're losing more and more kids because of the sort of graying effect that he refers to. So I think that's a statewide phenomenon, not anything specific to MAUSD or even necessarily Addison County. Might be a little different for Chittenden County, but overall the state's feeling that effect.
Mhm. And there is a, on the national scene, they do projections with regard to various, with regard to every state in terms of their numbers and numbers of young people. And there is clearly a continuing estimate which indicates that the numbers of students in all of New England, but certainly in Vermont, will continue to decline over a period of time. And if you look at slide number 10, we reference that. And you can see that there is a projected pre-K through 12 decline, and that would take place. And so that makes sense. It's something that's going on throughout New England, not in every town, but we're seeing about half of the towns in New England are actually experiencing a decline, and half are growing, but fewer in Vermont and Maine and New Hampshire.
So are we comfortable moving on to capacity of each of the buildings and then to get to the options?
Sure.
So if I could just do a little preface about how we define capacity, we actually have class size numbers that the district provided us, and you can see those on slide 31. And we look at all of the several components of each of the buildings, from administrative space, support space, instructional, some of the systems and maintenance, the site information. You can see that from the format of each of the elementary schools. So in order for you to understand how we calculated that current operating capacity, if you look at slide 35, and I'm going to use Beeman as alphabetical, it shows you that currently there are 2 K-2 classrooms. The class size for K-2 is 20. We multiply that by 20, it equals 40. There are 2 grade 3-6 classrooms. The class size numbers for grades 3 to 6 is 25. So that's times 50. So the current operating capacity is 90. That planned operating capacity is exactly the same, because what we would do between the current operating capacity and the planned operating capacity is to look at it to see if there are any deficiencies in the building. So if there's a lack of storage, if educators do not have the appropriate amount of instructional space in order to educate your students, we would take something offline. But we didn't need to do that for any of the elementary buildings. But we did note at the bottom that there are four full-size classrooms that are used for offices and team spaces. And so if those were reconfigured, you would add 100. Now that would be 190 students. That's what we're referring to by that number. So 190 students could be housed at Beeman Elementary School. Then we went through each of the components, noted the art room, the special ed spaces, core facilities, and those types of things. And I don't think we need to go through each of them, but if you have any questions, the same is, it's a little different for the middle and high school, the way that's calculated, But if you have any specific questions about the facilities and defining capacity, the school facilities review, John and I are more than happy to answer them for you.
Karen, I found it helpful when we were talking last week to recognize that from NESDEC's perspective, in terms of the planned operating capacity, you didn't want to be in a position to suggest that any one classroom that maybe it's an office space now, you didn't want to be in a position of suggesting that no longer be used for office space as you were proposing what the planned operating capacity could be. That's why it's in a footnote, not in the planned operating capacity section. This assumes we use the buildings as they're currently being used, with all the team rooms and offices, et cetera, that are in spaces that were at one point classrooms.
And that's the manner in which you wish to use that building. And certainly we would not comment on whether it should or shouldn't be used in that manner. Thank you, Patrick.
So I'm hearing there's no extra capacity in this building. Is that just to be clear?
No, there is. There are
Okay.
4 full-size classrooms at Beaman that, should the district decide to reconfigure or repurpose them, there would be excess capacity.
Okay, great, thank you.
That's what
In
that.
fact, more than twofold excess capacity.
Okay.
And so for my working sort of approach to this, and acknowledging that there are some footnotes too that NESDEC recommends sort of a 10% buffer from planned operating capacity to enrollment. The way I've sort of been internalizing this, knowing we're trying to figure out in what ways can we use our buildings differently. And if we stick with the Beaman example, because we're on that slide 35. So as we currently use it, the planned operating capacity is 90. If we made some changes in what we do with the classroom spaces that are not currently used for classrooms, Beaman could actually house 190 students. We would then take 19 off of that 190 to leave the 10% cushion that NESDEC would recommend. So that puts us, just about 170 students is where we could reasonably expect enrollment to be at Beaman if we're at full capacity.
That's correct.
Yep.
I had a question about that note, Patrick. I'm wondering if the trend for 30 years is declining enrollment in the district, why maintain a 10% growth capacity? I mean, that's not just a number that would be nice to maintain. That actually costs money. So should we be spending money every year to maintain the flexibility for a 10% growth capacity when over the past 30 years we've never seen any?
That's a good question.
Well, I think the response to that is that obviously that's a good point that you made. However, what we have seen in many, many instances throughout New England is that oftentimes districts are confronted with a surge that has been unexpected, A, or B, there are changes that come into play in the educational process, which require that a district which had been working with a particular class size average may have to reduce that. That occurred very significantly when small group instruction spaces were required, or adjustments were made in terms of educational programming that required, for example, at a high school level, some of the electives that students need to take, whether it be physics or whatever, oftentimes those numbers are significantly smaller than the average class sizes in the building. And therefore, districts typically do not want to be put in a position where they have to cut or do things that would diminish their program offerings. And so as a result of that, you know, we advise that, you know, a 10% capacity cushion is something that a district should consider. Does it have to be? No. Districts can make the decision not to do that, but then they are susceptible to unanticipated changes, which could create problems down the road if enrollment grows.
I also think there's something to be said for a little bit of flexibility. Like there could be some challenges in filling a building right to the brim with the most number of students it could possibly have. And so whether it's 10% or 5% or 8%, you know,
Right.
we could think through and try to figure out what would make sense. But I think the idea is probably want something less than every last student you could possibly squeeze in.
And there are variations at certain grade levels where you might have 30 students in second grade, and that's too large for one class, so you would have two. So you have to look at grade by grade enrollment in that case too. But it's sort of a guidepost for you to look at, that's all. And a district could make that decision to not maintain a full 10% capacity cushion.
Right.
In some ways, I think the 10% cushion might also honor some other work that's happening. So we just had our community roundtable event not that long ago where, from a long range perspective, some people are trying to do some things that might change our overall trajectory. And so if we do some planning that leaves a 10% cushion that honors the potential maybe someday of turning our enrollment trend around at least by 10%, which I think if we stopped losing students, that would be a tremendous success. If we grew by 10%, that would be something close to a miracle, I think.
Yep.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Thanks. So some of the feedback from the community, I was hoping you might be able to speak to, is that during COVID, I think some thoughts might have been that schools had the capacity to bring all of their students back and just separate them out enough because the numbers were so small in some of the classrooms. But we didn't see that happen. And I noticed that some of the schools like Starksboro maybe only had room for one empty classroom, whereas Bristol had 4 and New Haven had 4. So that didn't really seem to affect how we dealt with the pandemic, right? So we, as a district, we kind of handled all of the schools the same way. We weren't going to be able to send just the Beeman kids back full time and not the kids from the other school back full time. So I just, that had come up in some of the community engagement work.
So we'll let Patrick decide how he wants to respond to any COVID related questions. I think is the best, because we're not there to know the particulars of how it's being undertaken there.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head, Liz. So Beeman's an example of a school where we probably could have brought back all students and kept them 6 feet apart. But as a unified district, to make that happen in one place, which would create a very different experience for students than it would in another school, seemed to create an inequity that I wasn't comfortable with, and that really, as an admin team, we weren't very comfortable with. So that's what led to the decision to decide, unless we can bring all students back, we weren't going to select which schools could move forward in bringing them all back.
So any more questions about the capacity of each schools? We can move on to the options if there are none. So you can see with the options, there's a description, and we look at the specific grade level alignment, talk about advantages and challenges, But we also were tasked with thinking about how might you partner with Addison Northwest. So you'll see options A, B, and C at the end are the partnership with Addison Northwest. We also want to recognize that these options are not any recommendations that we are making. It is something that we have had extensive experience working with a lot of districts on thinking about what are some of the starting points for your conversations in the future as a facilities committee and what's next for your communities.
One of the things that was really helpful for me in our meeting last week was, so I noticed that perhaps with the only exception being option 1, all of the options mentioned the possibility of adding on to elementary schools, which I think we would recognize as politically challenging if we're closing down one building and then putting an addition on to a building in a different town. In talking with John and Karen about this, their point helped me understand why that's there. Because so many of these options, really, I think all of these options speak to closing some number of schools. It depends on which schools, right? We could choose schools that would not require any additions to any building anywhere if we chose certain schools to not operate anymore. If we chose different schools to not operate, that might necessitate putting additions on somewhere else. So that was on there simply because depending on which ones we chose, it's possible that we'd have to put an addition on. And now we may internally say, well, we're not going to pick an option that requires a big addition somewhere, and therefore we wouldn't have to do that.
Mm-hmm. That's accurate. Yep.
Well spoken.
So Patrick or team, when would we get to that granularity? That would be something that we would be doing with an architectural study as opposed to this capacity study?
I think that's something we'd have to consider, right? So as we're thinking about factors, the condition of the building may be a factor. If condition of the building is a driving factor, that's where perhaps the architectural study would help us, right? So we have the capacity analysis. I think to the extent that we need a capacity analysis to make decisions. I think we have our enrollment and demographic information to the extent that we need that. Perhaps the one area we're light on is sort of that more deep facilities dive and understanding those different needs, which maybe we need to do if there's some uncertainties around the capacity, but the capacity story and the enrollment story may be clear enough that we don't need to spend tens and tens of thousands more dollars doing a deep architectural and facilities dig if it seems evident that we shouldn't be operating one or more. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of the idea coming into this was, let's wait on the architectural aspect of the study, because there may be one or more buildings that we know we don't need to spend that money to study because it's clear that we shouldn't be operating. I'm not saying that's true from the results of this, but that was the reason we didn't jump right in to that study.
Can I ask a question? I noticed that in the options, I think I noticed that there are no options of not closing schools. And I think, if I remember correctly, in the, what is that document called? The charge to the committee, essential questions. I think there was a question of scenario 1, questions was keeping all 5 elementary schools open. So I was wondering, two questions. One is, what happened to that option about keeping all the elementary schools open? And 2 is, well, I'll just leave it at that. What happened to that option?
I can take a stab at that because John, Karen, and I talked a little bit about it. And then John and Karen, if you want to add to that, to my comments, that'd be great. But we talked about that and sort of, it seemed unnecessary for NESDEC and this wasn't necessarily any decision I was a part of. This was, I think, what NESDEC realized as it began its work. Wasn't a need for NESDEC to study our current condition, because we're well aware of our current condition because we're living it and breathing it. And I think some of the information that they have gathered for us, in particular about enrollment and demographics, helps us to understand the long range feasibility of that option. But it wasn't something that necessarily prompted the need for further study from NESDEC's perspective.
Well, that makes perfectly good sense.
NESDEC also isn't,
It's
NESDEC's
still,
not calculating the financial end of things.
Yeah.
That's something we have to do in-house, which we're doing. And so really the sustainability of that option where all buildings stay open is primarily a financial one that we're going to be doing in-house anyway. So that's sort of how I understood why that didn't land in the NESDEC report.
yeah, that makes perfectly good sense. I don't need any more elaboration. I get what you're saying.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
Does anybody else have any questions?
I think what's
So-
important to acknowledge here,
Oop.
Well, go ahead, Patrick.
I was just going to sort of acknowledge that, and again, John and Karen and I talked a little bit about this on Thursday last week in that initial review. These options, and I might have said this initially in my opening remarks, but these options don't perfectly line up to the options that we shared with NESDEC that we came up with as a community. There's a lot of kind of close matches. There are some that are, I think, pretty identical to the options we came up with, but it's not necessarily exactly option for option 1 through 4 that we came up with. It's a little bit different. And I just think it's important to acknowledge that.
I guess one question I had about that is there are a few options that talk about shifting grades around in a way that may be more conventional in other places, but is not the way it happens to be done here. And is there some reason why? Was it just because it's more conventional in other places that you talked about shifting the 5th and 6th grade to middle school and out of elementary school? Does it have is there a facilities reason too, or is it just an educational reason?
It's it's both. It's what occurs in many districts. The grade level configuration of a 6th, 7th, 8th, and combining them has for, let's say, 2 districts is a major factor, because first of all, it assists in terms of having more reasonable class sizes when, if the districts are experiencing major downturns. B, it enables the teaching staff to work more closely together and to coordinate. And so that's a major plus. And it has an economic piece that's tied to it, obviously, because in many instances you're having larger but perfectly acceptable class sizes. And so that's a major component of that. And we see that has been done in numerous districts, and it seems to work out very well. And it enables the district in some instances to expand programming options where they would not be able to if it were just the smaller grade level class size.
Thank you.
I have maybe it's an interrelated question. Is in some of the challenges, it talks about adding another transition to students by breaking those up. Is that really a big deal, or what's the impact there? I remember we did we did we were before COVID, we were, visiting every school for our board meetings, and we talked to a couple sixth graders at one of the schools, and they were so excited to get to Mount Abe and get a change and get away from all those little kids,
Yeah.
So I'm kind of wondering if that really is a big deterrent or not.
It is for some families, I would suggest. And it also can have an impact on transportation. If you do decide to place that true middle school model 6 to 8 building someplace other than where it is right now. That's the only thing. And John and I have presented in many, many, many communities during the public portion of this. Families will get up and say, I want my kid to go to an elementary school and then on to the middle school, high school combined. So that's really why we mention it.
From my perspective, Kevin, this fits into the category of things that we as adults think are bigger deals to kids than kids actually think they are.
And if you go to Chittenden County, they're already doing that.
Yeah.
It's not very far away.
Yeah, Jeff, that question struck me when I was reading the report. So, for instance, why are they drawing the line at 5 to 6 and 8 to 9 specifically? And I think it gets into it in the report that it's to achieve economies of scale in the different, if they were to break them into the middle school into a single place, so you can have a bigger offerings of a program. I also thought about multi-generational families and having a kid in high school, middle school, and grade school in 3 different sites, the challenges of that. And I was talking to an educator as well, and they alluded to a pedagogy here in the state of Vermont, which treats grade school students differently than middle school and high school students. Specifically to middle school students, that they promote clustering and hanging of kids. So because that's specific to the development of those kids. So that's actually a pretty positive thing, in having a middle school that's a little bit more obvious.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can imagine all that. I guess the thing that I was concerned about, from the facilities perspective is cost. I mean, it would be nice to do all kinds of things, but I think we're already in such a tight spot.
Yeah.
That unless it's presented to the community as though this is the least costly burden that can be imposed, it's going to meet a lot of resistance.
Well, I think that raises a really good question. I mean, what is the charge? Is it preserving education or value, which I think has been a degree all we've all been talking about, or is it the bottom line? We could all race the bottom line for everyone in the warehouse and be done with it. But I don't think that states to our values as a community. And secondly, there's a geography component to the way these townships are laid out. We have a couple valleys that we're dealing with. The people in Lincoln and Starksboro are in some ways a lot closer than New Haven and Moncton. I think that's where the conversation I would like to be having is, where does it make sense to consolidate these groups into communities that can be realistic?
And I think you hit the nail on the head, Josh, because the answer is yes to all of those. Those are all combining to create the charge that I think we have, which is what makes it so tricky. If it was absolutely, it's about the bottom dollar, this is an easy problem to solve. If it's absolutely about the curricular component and the program offerings, this is an easy problem to solve. Because we have to try to find the best balance of both of those and the geography that you mentioned, now it gets really complicated. And I think that's what we're wrestling with.
People lose sight when you go out and buy something, you're constantly comparing price and quality and making the adjustments of buying the best thing you can feel that you can afford. In this situation, we don't look at it that way, but it's really the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And really, we haven't necessarily identified what's actually our greatest challenge, and that is the emotional aspect, because that's what people go to the polls with. And from a logical perspective, the people of Lincoln think it's perhaps perfectly logical for New Haven to close their school. But I bet the people of Lincoln don't think it's perfectly logical to close Lincoln School. So
Yeah.
that's I think an example of the challenge and the emotional aspect. And as it stands now, we have to basically, if assuming a decision is that we should ask a town to close their school, we're going to basically be asking one or more towns to take one for the team and close their community school for the benefit of everyone else. That's a heavy ask. That's a big ask.
It is, and there's no, you're absolutely right on with that. And obviously it does create some emotional pushback and so on. However, we have found that in many instances, because the option also leads to potential improvement in programming options and opportunities for the students to be in possibly larger groups and larger programming opportunities, that oftentimes it can be viewed by many parents as a plus. And so there's no doubt that it gets difficult, and there can be a lot of pushback. But on the other hand, there are also possibilities that it could show parents that the programming that their child will receive will be improved significantly, partially because of the larger numbers and partially because of opportunities to expand program.
Patrick, can I ask you a question based on what you just said about the tension between emotions and costs? Because I think that's going to be a big issue, maybe the determinative issue. So we understand that in the MAUSD options, although keeping all 5 elementary schools open isn't on the list, it is an option. With regard to the combination with the Virgins schools, is there an option of keeping all 5 elementary schools open and having the middle school and high school combined? Is that also implicitly an option, even though it's not written here, or that's?
Yeah, I think that's the other challenge. Is I would say there aren't any options off the table right now. I will say what's important is at some point, some options are going to have to come off the table, because we can't continue to consider everything forever, because we're going to have to lead toward a decision at some point. So I would say, yes, that's possible. From a practical standpoint, I don't think that would produce the kind of savings that we anticipate needing to find. It's an option, yes. I don't know that it's an option that will necessarily meet our financial needs, though it may do some things programmatically at the secondary level.
So I might add,
John and Patrick, one quick question. Are the options that are engineered here, are they all presented with the trajectory of satisfying the budget issues? Meaning, if we choose one of these options and it doesn't solve the budget issue, that's what I'm trying to avoid.
Each of these options has many options within them, right? So if we look at option 2, it says closure of 3 elementary schools. Well, which 3 elementary schools we choose has a significant impact on the budgetary savings. So it depends on it. So I think the answer is it depends on what those decisions are that we make within any one of these options. And that may in and of itself still be insufficient, depending on our continued projections with the financials. So we're actually currently crunching some of those numbers right now to try and even dial in for FY22, let alone 24 or 26 or something further down the road. And we are looking at needing to find a lot of savings, even just for FY22 as we currently sit.
I might also add that part of our charge lists out the scenarios that were worked through at length through a lot of different engagement through community administration and that staff. And some of the things, even the one you just mentioned, Jeff, with keeping all the 5 schools, elementaries open and combining with Virgins on junior and high, was on that list at one time. So if we as a group decide that one of these scenarios that we're charged with is not the right one, we're gonna, I believe, we will have to come up with a very clear rationale as to why it's preferred over the previous work that's already been done.
But I think it's also important to know, and this is where things get kind of tricky sometimes as we work. The role of this committee is to help me in making a recommendation to the school board. So this committee actually doesn't make a recommendation to the board, except for supporting me in doing that, which in a way I would say is good for you and bad for me, because I don't think anyone wants to be left holding the bag with having to make a recommendation here. So that offers some cover to all of you and acknowledges that that's part of the responsibility of the position of superintendent, is to do the work with folks, understand the different perspectives, understand the information, and get to a place where he or she is advising or making a recommendation to the board for consideration. In the end, the board has to decide what gets put before the voters or doesn't, but they need me as superintendent to help guide that process, along with their community engagement efforts and support from this committee, et cetera. But procedurally, that's where this goes.
And then the other point I wanted to make about the high school being used as a 7 through 12 for both districts and closing one high school building is that the operating capacity of the high school would not be sufficient to accommodate the enrollments, the 7 through 12 enrollments of both districts, and without having some programming issues or class size issues. And so that's another concern that when we went through that, we found that would not be necessarily a valid option.
That's why all those options had basically one of the 2 high school buildings being a middle school and the other one being a high school, or some version of what, different grade configurations, but effectively one's a middle school, one's a high school.
I have a couple questions about the combined ones, or one prime, and I just want to clarify, and it's probably stating the obvious, but when it talks about realigning grade schools, that's only the MAUSD district on our part. It's not, we're not walking in step with Northwest at that point.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep.
And I think the important thing, from my perspective, this is personal obviously, but from my perspective, the important thing with a high school is, the utilization of the high school of all the buildings we got right now is the highest, I think, if I calculated things right. But the programming aspects to keep a student population base so that we have good programming that serves the wide community of general education all the way through college prep is at risk at Mount Abe, because we can't. There's a concern about economically staffing it. So on a high school level, we may not be looking at it from a point of view of saving space as much as program preservation.
Right. Yeah. And it's in other words, if the 2 schools were, if the 2 student bodies from the high school and middle school were combined, then that would result in a situation where adequate space would become a problem. And therefore, districts, when they have to deal with that, would have to talk in terms of potentially cutting back programming in areas where there might be smaller class sizes, but those might be the elective courses or things along those lines that some of the students absolutely need to take in order to qualify for engineering or something along those lines when they graduate. And so it's it's an important thing to consider, that there needs typically at the high school level especially to be adequate space in order to accommodate programming. Now, sure, in some cases they can take online courses, in some cases they can do other things for very, very small class sizes to keep them going. But overall, we have found that it could become a major problem for some schools if they don't have adequate space.
I also wanted to note that we have not had a chance to talk these over with Addison Northwest. We're doing that on Wednesday. So while you have had, it still says draft about those that are combined with Addison Northwest, we'll do that conversation on Wednesday and then reconsult back with Patrick.
And I did talk briefly today with Addison Northwest superintendent, just in looking at these, because she has a draft of it as well. And we kind of talked through a little bit and acknowledge that that conversation has yet to happen. I also just want to acknowledge, to Kevin's point, whether we're talking about closing schools or not closing schools, the economic driver is staffing efficiencies. That's where the dollar savings come from, is by creating those efficiencies that allow us to maintain programming while keeping the costs low. And fewer buildings facilitates efficient use of staff, which sort of maximizes our dollars to keep as much programming as possible. And as Kevin talked about at the high school level, like we've trimmed, I don't know how many millions of dollars out of our budget over the past few years, but it's probably in the $3 to $5 million range in terms of savings that we've had to realize to get our budgets to where they are, some of which have narrowly passed. And we've done that in large part at the elementary level, getting class sizes kind of right size and equitably sized across schools, and leaving high school staffing, in particular professional staffing at the high school, as intact as possible, because we're at a point where when we start making cuts to personnel at the high school level, we are also cutting programming.
Yep.
In particular, in a small high school in Vermont, a person is a program. So we have a chemistry teacher. So that has an impact. If we had 5 chemistry teachers and we could go down to 4 chemistry teachers to save money and our class sizes go up, well, we still offer chemistry. If we have a chemistry teacher and that chemistry teacher can't be afforded anymore, we don't have chemistry anymore.
Yeah.
So that's the point where we're on the cusp of that at the secondary level, because we've tried to stay away from any reductions there. We've made almost all the reductions we can at the elementary level without really stripping back programming. So now we're going to have to start looking at the secondary level, and we're going to really start to feel the effects. One, it's not entirely impossible. And again, we're still working on the numbers, but it's not entirely impossible that we may need to realize $2 million in savings to get down to the spending threshold for FY22. That equates to about 25 professional staff. So when you start thinking about what that means to our programming, let's say we had to get 15 of those 25 out of Mount Abe, and the other 10 came from the elementary schools. That begins to not just chip away at our programming, that begins to decimate our programming. And that's sort of the challenge that we're up against if we can't create some efficiencies, either in combination with Addison Northwest or internally within MAUSD.
Patrick, did you in your conversation with Addison Northwest, are they in the same zero-sum game with their programming?
They're further into the zero-sum game than we are. So they're actually in more dire, they're basically a year ahead of us. Where they are currently is where I project will be effectively in a year from now, where they've already chosen not to operate one school to create some efficiencies to find savings. And now they're still looking at, okay, so what reductions at the high school level do we make now? Because what goes? Do high school sports go? Does driver's ed go? Does chemistry go? Do AP courses go? What, we can't keep it all and stay under the spending threshold. I think they also recognize if they put out a budget that asks their voters to pay a huge penalty, that it probably doesn't go well. Yeah, they're there right now for sure.
Patrick doesn't, of course, not familiar with all the internal economic details, but theoretically, the argument that you're making there argues in favor of combining the high school and the middle school. Why is that not obvious? Why is that not an obvious thing to be considering? If they have a chemistry teacher and Mount A and MAUSD has a chemistry teacher, to use the example you were just using, and each school can't afford their own chemistry teacher, but together the two schools can have a chemistry teacher, so you can cut some staff and preserve the program. What am I missing?
I don't think you're missing anything. I think that's exactly what we're trying to do, and there are obviously challenges in doing that. So let's say we have 5 students in chemistry and they have 5 students in chemistry, which wouldn't necessarily be able to be supported with a 1.0 FTE teacher in each building. But together, maybe we could have a 1.0. Which building does that 1.0 actually sit in, and which building do those students attend? Do we do it all virtually when we know kids don't necessarily get the same experience if one half is always virtual and the other half is always present? So yeah, I think to have our high school students all in the same building and our middle school students also all in the same building, whichever building that may be, absolutely makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
In particular, if that's happening in a merged school district. Where that's happening in 2 different school districts adds further complication, but yes, that kind of thinking is exactly what we're talking about, and I think that's in a couple of the options. I don't know if it's A, B, or C, but that's the idea. Put our middle school kids in the same building as Virgins, and put our high school kids in the same building as Virgins, and figure out which one of the 2 buildings we have is middle school and which one of the 2 is high school.
But
I just want to say, when I read the report, I really saw options B and C as being kind of a really nice middle ground, because each community got to preserve their high school facility. So that was my takeaway. Of course, I need more time to look at this and digest it. I'm sure there's an emotional component to this that's keeping me from getting over the speed bump. But and of course, I think there's still grade school closures. But that was my takeaway. I'm not going to beat around the bush with it. I think that a strategy like that keeps a high school-ish type building in both communities is probably going to be the most amenable to both groups.
And I'll add to do that the proper way, or at least the proper way as I see it, means really taking our 2 school districts and merging into a single unified school district, much like the process we went through in each of our communities a while back, but now taking what our new districts and merging those, because that facilitates what you just described, or what is in option B, in a much more reasonable way, and adds to the savings, right? So if we're operating as a single school district, we wouldn't need all of the central office staffing that we each have. Exactly what the staffing levels would need to be, we'd need to figure that out, but we certainly don't need 2 superintendents for this one new school district. So you can understand the savings there. And really, ultimately, what we're trying to do is, how do we find ways to trim overhead so that we can spend a higher percentage of our dollars on the programming that we want to offer our students? So central office staffing is a form of overhead. I don't think either one of our offices are overstaffed right now. But if we merged and we were operating a single, say, $50 million business instead of a 30 million and a 20 million separately, there are absolutely efficiencies that could be found. So that from a governing standpoint, it makes a lot more sense to do it that way. And from an economic standpoint, it makes a lot more sense to do it that way. Which I should also say only happens from a sort of grassroots effort on our communities, because there's nothing coming down the pike from the state that's going to suggest or support or in any way make happen the merging of our two districts. That's going to have to come from grassroots. I've been in conversation with the Secretary of Education. He said, Act 46 isn't done yet in lots of parts of the state. No one has any appetite for Act 46 round 2 right now. Having said that, if our communities wanted to do it, there's probably nothing that would get in the way, but no one else is going to come lead the charge for this. It's going to have to come from, if that's something that our communities think should happen.
So we're coming up on 4:30, which is the scheduled end of this meeting. We have not gone on to item number 4, which we can table if that's the desire. If we've got more questions for John and Karen, we should probably summarize and allow them to get on with their lives.
I apologize. I'm in the middle of a massive thunderstorm and wherever. They had, how different did the Addison Northwest really look compared to the Mount Aid study? I'm just curious. Was it drastically different, or were they really quite similar?
Well, we use a very similar format and a similar template in doing this. It's based on, obviously we modify it as we go along, but it's based on hundreds of different demographies that have been done over time. And so we know what the key factors are. There were some, but then obviously from district to district, capacities of schools, age of schools, and to a certain extent, some of the factors that affect enrollments are different. And so we use the same format with what we presented, and we'll be talking to them about on later on in this week. But some of the issues were different. Overall, there's been a general, issue concerning student enrollments and so on, but we're going to review the whole thing with them this week and then go from there.
Thanks.
I talked with Sheila Sewell, the superintendent there earlier today, and we sort of remarked that we're in such a similar place in terms of the economic impact, declining enrollment. Like it's pretty much the same story, and they're a year ahead, as I said. But we in some ways have more options because we have more schools. They have now 2 elementary schools and a middle high school.
Yep.
There are only so many ways you can rearrange those buildings, right? So we have 5 elementary schools and a middle high school, a lot more when you think about just even from a mathematical perspective. The number of iterations that we could come up with is considerably greater than the number of iterations they could come up with. So I think that's maybe the main difference as I see it.
Yep.
Which is a blessing and a curse, I will say.
Any other questions for John and Karen?
I don't have any questions, but I did put some corrections to some of the staffing in the chat. We don't have to talk about it, but I double checked, and I think those are the things that need to get fixed before this goes out.
And I saw that. Now, how do I access that after we've left the meeting?
How about I email you instead?
Perfect. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Gang, I'm sorry, I have to go. I have another commitment. So
Okay.
carry on. We'll see it in the minutes. Thank you, John and Karen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your input.
Well, I think it sounds like we've reviewed the report to the extent we want to, and you've answered our questions. So I guess, Patrick, we can say thank you and go to the next issue. Go and see what the next generation of the report is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
very much, John and Karen.
Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Take care.
So at this point, it's 4:32. We can keep, when we've lost one of our members, we can go on to what was planned to be the next item to talk about the charge questions, or we can table that for another meeting. So whatever the pleasure of the group is.
My sense is that won't be a short conversation. I'm glad it was on the agenda, just so everyone can be reminded that those, in addition to the NESDEC study, there are a number of those questions there that is part of our charge to really sort of help me think through and think of what a response might be to some of those. And frankly, in looking at those, some are easier to answer than others, we'll say. I'm not convinced that they all necessarily have answers, right? They may be more considerations than questions that need answers, but I do think it's important for us as a committee to look at those questions and be thoughtful and mindful of those as we're considering the various options that we learned through the NESDEC study and as we work towards some sort of a recommendation.
So what's the appetite?
What's your time frame for, I don't know, when you say I want to present something to the board, what is that actual last date?
That's a great question. I've been wondering the same thing, and I don't really have a lot of clarity on that either. I think it's something that, it's one of these inevitable things that no one really wants to necessarily get to, but we're going to have to. And I'm picking up on that sort of vibe. But I may be seeking some direction from the board about when, as we can now look at the timeline again with the NESDEC study complete, when does that have to happen so that we can do a little backwards design from there? I know when we think about the longer range planning, I think there's still interest in a town meeting day sort of timeline to work backwards from, to be able to put something in front of voters on that day if that decision is made. And that has us, you know, by the end of January, the board would have to determine what's the ask of the community and and have a warning ready to go and the ballot ready to go and everything else. So if we work backwards from there, it probably needs to be October, November is probably when some sort of recommendation needs to come out. So there's time for the community to react and understand and the board to process, et cetera, leading up to that January. Here's the warning, here's what the ballot's going to say.
So if that ask ends up being a merger with another district, is that an earlier time frame, or is that an ask for a town meeting thing? Because wouldn't you have then, I don't know, like we did a charter or a plan or whatever they were with Act 46, we had put that out for election day 2016, and we ended up with, I don't know how many, I mean, that took a long time to complete. I would imagine that it would be, I'm hoping, a lot more of an efficient process, but there wouldn't need to be a vote to go through the study, or would there need to be, like, is it a vote after the study or before the study is what I'll call it, but, or before it?
So I guess it depends is the answer. If the decision is to form a study, then that initiates a different process that lands on a different vote at the end of the study. If the decision is, yes, we want to merge, and it assumes any studying that we were going to be studying happened prior to January, which is quick, then that could be a decision, yes, it's, do you wish to merge with Addison Northwest? And the first date of operation most likely would be not the following school year, but the one after, because it would take a year of transition to make that happen. And there is, I'm not super familiar with the process, but there's an approval process. Like if our community has decided, yes, this is what we want to do, either beforehand or afterhand, that decision to become a single district would need approval at a higher level. I don't know if that rests with the Secretary of Ed or perhaps more the state board, and maybe even legislative, but I think at the very least with the Secretary or with the state board. And I would add that if you look at any of the options that involved joining forces with Addison Northwest, they all also included having fewer elementary schools in our district. So in some ways, if we made a decision to have fewer elementary schools and we asked communities to do that, and they did, we would be moving in the direction of being better positioned to combine with Addison Northwest. So that's another way to think about a path forward.
Can I also ask, if you created a new district before requiring it, then maybe that new district that you're voting on doesn't require the vote on the closure of elementary schools. So, right? You could actually flip the sequence if you looked at it that way.
Yep, if we would probably have to rewrite articles of agreement. And if those articles of agreement gave the authority to close schools to the school board, then that would give a different authority than we have. It's an authority that Addison Northwest already has, but we do not.
Yeah.
And for what it's worth, that could be something that we ask the voters of MAUSD. And that's something that the board's going to have to wrestle with too, is it easier, better, advantageous to ask a community to take one for the team to benefit everyone? Or is it more advantageous to ask the community to delegate that authority to the board to make the hard decision? There are different schools of thought on which approach makes sense.
I'm not hearing a lot of burning desire to move into the next topic, so would somebody make a motion to table it to the next meeting? Or,
Yeah, I think we have enough to think about right now. I mean, I'm still thinking about, I'd love to hear everyone's 10-second thought on the report personally before we get, and then maybe that's a good way to wrap up the meeting, and hopefully it's more optimistic than not.
okay, can you make a motion to table? item
Motion to
5 then?
table the remaining agenda items.
Second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Oh, wait a minute, do
Aye.
we have any discussion?
Oh,
No, favor, opposed? Okay, so we can probably, Josh, take and do the infamous group hug and kind of display or talk about our opinions and then we can wrap it up potentially. Who wants, you want to sit back and wait, Josh, or you want to head it off?
I'll head it off. I'm cautiously optimistic. I think there's a lot of opportunity here, and I think the chat is really going to be engaging the public and having them see the opportunities and coming down. A lot of these buildings that we're working on are aging and do better. So that's the architect in me coming out, but I do see a lot of opportunity here. Thank you.
Thanks. Sarah?
I'm going to throw in my personal side hat here. I was worried to move in to the district because of its history, its size, and I would say always, to me, it was always an issue with the high school. As the chemistry teacher in a different district, I'm not one. I am one of, like, we'll say we're 2.5 of us, because we also do other things. But the opportunity that I feel like kids and families flocking to Chittenden County, I just still come back to the fact that if we can, I get people hanging on to their elementary schools. I feel like, but to me, it's always been about that next level. And I think that the report did a pretty good job of highlighting some of those opportunities, at least that were programmatic and could be helpful. And that's why I like that we have a lot of options. But to me, it's always been, you know, instead of everyone leaving and going north, how can we keep them here? And my kids are going to Mount Abe next year, so one of them is, and I'm kind of optimistic and excited for that. And and I wouldn't be less excited if there was a merger, and I wouldn't be, I kind of feel like we should throw it all on the table, and I like that the study did that and had their own options. So.
Thank you. Katrina, I'm sorry.
I like that it's now all sort of packaged in one place, and that it's, you know, there's some data to look at, and it's not yet another slideshow from Patrick. It's nice just to have that other lens with people who've, you know, done this before, and they're professional, they're emotion free, but they are empathetic, which I think is important. I am trying really hard just to keep my head clear about, you know, what the timeline needs to really look like. That part starts to, you know, freak me out just because of where we are at the moment with our timeline of starting school up again. So it's a little too much for my head right now, but I appreciate that I can go back and I can scrub my thoughts and my ideas. I have a couple of things that I'm curious why they weren't in the study. So I'm going to jot those down, and whenever it's appropriate, you know, see if there's other things that people think maybe we might be missing that they could either help us with, or we might want to complement the report with. But that's where I'm at right now.
Thank you. Floyd?
Sorry, unmuting. I'm excited to have some numbers that back up the trends that we've internally been processing, so that it gives us the ability to really share this with more than just, this is our thoughts. You know, to have the expert in the room is always a big positive, and hopefully because of that, and then plugging in those numbers and then showing what the long-term effect is going out 7 or 8 years, will spur action.
Thank you. Patrick, any more follow on?
No, I already spoke way more than I should have this meeting. I covered a lot of ground though, so I'll stand with what I've said.
Oh, thank you for that. Well, so I was very impressed with the demographics and the breakdowns to project out 10 years and have it so clearly laid out really reinforces a lot of the trends. And there's some noise going on, and I sort of brought it up about the whole New York City is going to flock to Vermont and all that kind of stuff. But those efforts to whatever becomes of that is going to be not significant. I'm a little, I don't know if I should say disappointed, but I didn't really get a whole lot out of the options. They were divergent, if anything. So, I mean, we've still got that task before us, or Patrick has, and we assist him however you want to look at that. But, the 30,000 foot stuff that we talked about today about the districts, the overall history of enrollment, projection of enrollment, what the variants are on that is all really good, and really provides us with some good information. So I'm excited about that. From a community point of view, Liz, do you have anything to comment or add?
I appreciated that they noted that not only for me that the programming concerns, like for instance chemistry, but also that they added on the report that would also for special education, that kids would have perhaps better access to programming or educators for those needs. And I liked that they put as using the building as a community center as an advantage for a possible school closing, that was looked at as an advantage for that. So I appreciated that.
Thank you. I believe we're at the point, unless you want to keep going, that somebody could entertain a motion to adjourn without trying to guide the end of this.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Wave or whatever. Any opposed? That's good. So, so the next meeting, we tentatively set the next meeting up for the 14th of September. The first Monday is on Labor Day. So I don't know if with fall schedules and whatnot, if this time frame or Mondays or what is going to work best for everybody.
I can no longer do 3 o'clock.
Bummer,
I'm going back to school, I hope.
Bummer, huh? So Patrick, should we get should we get Jennifer to do a doodle poll or something to kind of recenter what works the best for everybody?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't unmute. We can definitely do that, yes.
Okay, great. And is it consensus that we'll probably move to like an evening, or what? Where does she start? Does she start after 5, 4, 10?
I'm curious.
5 is okay with me on a Monday.
Yeah.
5 o'clock, Sarah? Okay.
Yeah, I have our school meetings are on Mondays, and I really have to go to those, so or participate till 4:30. It's just a side story.
I'm not going to give you a note to give Elaine that says you don't have to go, so.
No, it's fine.
And it doesn't have to be Mondays if there's a different day that works. So, but it sounds like if it's a Monday, it'll be 5 o'clock or later. And do we want to just try for Mondays, or do we want to pick a different day at an earlier time?
Mondays are fine with me if it's at 5, and I could probably do a tiny bit earlier if it was a different day of the week, but I am sensing that I don't really know my life coming up in the next couple of months, just to be candid.
That may be the only thing we know is that there's a lot we don't know.
I don't really know when I go to work, don't go to work, my kids, I don't know.
All right, so we'll try to stick with Mondays, and we'll shoot for 5 o'clock, and we'll send a doodle poll out on some dates and try to get it pinned down.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It was a great meeting.
Thank you.
Cheers. See you tomorrow, right?